This is going to be a real brief overview of the overall structure of the nervous system, the kind of two main components, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. And then we'll look briefly at different ways of looking at the brain so that researchers can detect what's going on while people are processing and tracking mental processes, as well as brain functioning and perhaps brain damage. So we'll start with the structure of the nervous system. And basically there are two categories. The first is the central nervous system here. And the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. That is the kind of command center for the body as well as for the nervous system. And then the other part is the peripheral nervous system. So that's the nervous system that's every other nerve outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So it's all the other connectors that go to your peripherals, your peripheries, your arms, your legs, things like that. So those are kind of the two overarching nervous systems, and we call them the CNS for central nervous system and the PNS, just to kind of shorten it up. These two systems work together to help your body stay in control and then react to your surroundings. So the peripheral nervous system is generally the part of the body that is acquiring the information from the surroundings, and then it sends that information through all those nerve impulses that we've talked about before, up the spinal column to the brain where the process happens, and then the nerve impulses race back down and out to the peripherals in order to react. That's essentially how it goes. The one exception to that is reflexes. We'll talk about that later. But these systems happen obviously at lightning speed and are interconnected throughout your entire body. So we'll start by looking at the peripheral nervous system. So, and again, it's further breakdown. I mean, you can break these down to such complex levels, but we'll try and stay kind of looking at the big picture. And the peripheral nervous system has two primary systems. First is the somatic nervous system, and that is responsible for voluntary movement of your large skeletal muscles. So if you decide to pick something up, that is a voluntary movement of your skeletal muscles. If you're flexing, if you're lifting weights, if you're running, that is voluntary movement of your large skeletal muscles. That is the somatic nervous system. And then you have the autonomic nervous system, and this controls the smooth muscles of your body. Essentially, those are the muscles you don't think about using but are being used constantly. Your heart, your digestive tract, and things of that sort. The smooth muscles, the non-skeletal muscles, as we call them. And the autonomic nervous system can be broken down into two, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, you're seeing all these subcategories, and it's worth kind of keeping this hierarchy in mind as we go through. The sympathetic nervous system is kind of all those processes that burn energy within the autonomic nervous system, and it is responsible for fight or flight reactions. So when you get scared, when you have a high intensity situation, you see an increase in heart rate and respiration. That is the nervous system, right? That is taking care of your heart and your lungs and those sorts of things. Then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is kind of the opposite of the sympathetic, and that's all about having your body conserve energy. So generally what happens in a fight or flight situation is blood is transferred away from your digestive areas and kind of non-necessary for fight or flight, and to your skeletal muscles. Because if you need to fight somebody, you need blood pumping through the muscles in your arms, or if you need to run, you need blood pumping through your legs. So when that fight ends, so that's kind of when the sympathetic nervous system activates. And when that fight ends is when that fight or flight ends is when the parasympathetic system begins. And blood is kind of returned from the skeletal muscles to the stomach. It slows your heart rate down a little bit, and it conserves the energy that you had. So in a flight or fight situation, you need to use as much energy as possible, as quickly as possible to survive. Once you have survived that system, your body needs to return to homeostasis, to the level it was before that reaction. And that's where the parasympathetic nervous system comes in. And it tells your body, hey, get things back to normal. Blood goes back to the digestive tract, and so it starts activating again. So that's kind of the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, again, is the brain and the spinal cord. And that is it. And both of those are surrounded by what's called the cerebrospinal fluid, And that fluid kind of helps to protect the brain and the spine, and it also provides nourishment to them. As I mentioned before, the spinal cord sends information to the brain. So it receives information from the peripheral nervous system and then shoots it up your back through the spinal column up to the brain. And there the brain processes that information. And so there are two kind of different nerves. Two different ways of looking at these nerves. Nerves that send information to the brain are known as afferent neurons, and then nerves that take information away from the brain are known as efferent neurons. And the way to kind of remember the difference between afferent and efferent is afferent is taking information is arriving at the brain. So it starts with an A, arriving. Efferent is information exiting the brain, E, exiting. So you have afferent information coming up the spinal cord, brain processes and then sends back through the efferent neurons down the spinal cord out to the peripheral muscles in order to communicate to the peripheral muscles what to do, given the stimulus that it's reacting to from the outside environment. So there you have that. Most movements are controlled by the brain, but there is a small group of movement that is controlled by direct transmission from the spinal cord. So the information never really processes through your brain. It just goes to the spinal cord and shoots back out. And those are known as reflexes. So when you're at the doctor's office and you're sitting on the edge and he hits your knee, he or she hits your knee and your leg jerks up, that is a reflex. That is controlled from the spinal cord instead of going up through the brain. So those reflexes are kind of automatic reactions that occur from the neurons through the spinal cord rather than going all the way up to the brain. So that's kind of the breakdown. And again, this is a super simplistic overview of a breakdown of the peripheral and central nervous system and kind of how your body reacts and responds to each of those. But now we're going to look at kind of a few techniques for looking at the brain. The first is an EEG. An EEG measures different changes in the brain's electrical activity. They put kind of electrodes all over your head. And what this does is it allows researchers to have people engage in various activities while these electrodes are placed on their head. And this will then allow for the researchers to understand which areas of the brain are firing at any given moment, and that helps to understand what functions are happening in different areas of the brains. And it gives researchers then a greater look at what the brain does during various tasks, whether that's translating languages, whether that's reacting to scary scenes or happy scenes or things like that. Other things are CAT scans, which are cross-sectional images of the brains. They take multiple X-rays and they kind of overlay them on top of each other to get that. MRIs are their electromagnets get 3D structural images of the brain, but that's kind of a long process. But nonetheless, it allows us to kind of see if there's any brain damage going on there because of its 3D resolution. And then you have PET scans or PET scans, and those allow scientists to really view the brain as it's working. And so it's pretty interesting. What happens is there's glucose happening in your brain, and glucose is kind of like the fuel of the brain. It's what allows things to happen. And so this PET scan can detect this glucose, and it changes to a different color. And so it notices that when glucose is being used at high levels in a given area, that indicates that that part of the brain is more active. So again, it's like the EEG, and it helps us to narrow in on what part of the brain is really being actively used in various tasks. And so that is a useful tool for scientists and for psychologists as well to understand how brain processes work and localized areas of the brains reacting in different ways. So this is just, and all of these different ways are useful in their own right. It depends on what you want to look at in the brain. It depends on what answers you're trying to get, what questions you have. But any one of these are valuable tools for scientists, researchers, and doctors to use. So these are some of the non-invasive ways for us to look at brains and to get a deeper understanding of what's going on.